Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this very important webinar on navigating the U.S. policy in Syria. My name is Delano Roosevelt. I'm the President and CEO of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, which is a 41-year-old nonprofit educational organization located in Washington, D.C. Our discussion today will focus on the perspectives of U.S. engagement in Syria, the lessons learned over the past decade, and potential paths forward in addressing both short-term challenges and long-term opportunities for peace and stability. As the situation in Syria continues to evolve, U.S. policy remains a critical factor in shaping the region's future. The implications of this conflict stretch beyond Syria's borders, impacting global security, humanitarian conditions, and regional geopolitics. For this discussion, we have gathered three leading voices on the Middle Eastern policy and the Syrian conflict to share their invaluable insights on one of the most complex and enduring crises of our time. I'm going to be making some introductions. If it looks like I'm reading, I am, because I don't want to get anything wrong on these three gentlemen. They're too important. First, I'd like to introduce Ambassador James Jeffrey, a former U.S. Special Representative for Syria engagement and former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey. Currently, he is the chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jeffrey has been at the forefront of U.S. policy on Syria and brings deep diplomatic experience and understanding of regional dynamics. Next, we have Dr. Neil Quilliam, a senior research fellow at Chatham House and leading expert on Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Quilliam has extensively analyzed the geopolitical landscape of the region, particularly the intersection of energy policy, governance, and international relations, and has insights, and his insights will be crucial to our discussion today. Finally, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Ghassan Hitto, the president of the Syrian Forum USA, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing aid and supporting Syrian civil society. Mr. Hitto has been an advocate for Syrian communities, both inside and outside the country, and brings a humanitarian perspective that is essential to understanding the broader impact of U.S. policy on the ground. Moderating this discussion will be our very own Dr. Fadi Hilani, our senior academic and research fellow with the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. Born in Aleppo, Syria, Dr. Hilani brings both personal and academic insight to our discussion. Before joining the National Council, Dr. Hilani served as a professor at Aleppo University in Syria and Montclair State University in New Jersey. Dr. Fadi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Del, for this very general introduction, and I would like to join you in welcoming our distinguished guests, of course. And I think we are at a very critical juncture in American politics, actually, with American voters going to vote for the next president. So with this in mind, Ambassador Jeffrey, what do you think the upcoming U.S. president should keep in mind, lessons learned from the last 10 years about U.S. engagement in Syria?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. This is really important, and frankly, it has been neglected. The first thing they need to understand is that Syria has to be looked at not only as a crucial conflict for the future of the Middle East, but that it is in three different layers. The first and most basic layer is a civil war between much of the population of Syria and the Assad regime beginning in 2011, thus now 13 years ago. And that is continuing, albeit at a lower level. The effort to resolve it was crystallized in UN resolution in 2015, that established a ceasefire call and a call for reconciliation, a new constitution, and various other steps. That resolution is still the basic fundament of policy towards Syria by the US and many other states. The second level is, of course, massive fighting between various actors, with 5 outside military forces, Russian, Iranian, US, Turkish, and Israeli involved there. And for the last year or so, occasionally Jordanian Air Force strikes, going after various targets, either related to the civil war or against, in the case of the Israelis, the Iranians and Hezbollah. In the case of the US, the Islamic State, which is an offshoot of the fighting. And then at the highest level, this is a fight for the future of the region by those forces of disorder, Iran, Russia, and Assad himself, to change the trajectory of the region towards growing stability and growing engagement with the rest of the world, to the kind of chaos we see in Lebanon, we see in Yemen, we see in Syria. In going forward, the administration, whichever it is, needs to realize that while the US was not successful in the Trump administration in achieving a UN-based solution to the conflict under the 2015 resolution, what we did do is freeze the conflict. The conflict has remained frozen. The Biden administration basically continued this policy, kept US troops on the ground, kept coordinating with the Israelis and the Turks, which were very difficult, and supported the UN, but at a much lower level, which I regret. But on the other hand, not that much has changed, including the return of Syria to the Arab League has not really changed anything, because Assad is not making any concessions necessary to bring this to an end. So the first thing the administration, whichever one it is, needs to do is, apart from recognizing the problem, continue to freeze the conflict while seeking with the UN, with our Arab partners, with the Europeans, a way in, potentially with the Russians, a way to move forward. I'll stop.
Thank you very much for this background, Ambassador Jeffrey. And I would love to speak about like the US involvement with the regional powers in a moment. But let me focus for a minute on Russia, actually. You mentioned like the US has been actually involved in many regional powers. And we know that Russia's intervention in Syria actually has changed a lot of the political and military scene in the region. With a specific eye on Russia, like we know there has been moments actually of collaboration and confrontation between the US and Russia in Syria. And we know that there were moments of these collaboration when they, of course, leaders from the two sides were trying to deconflict their military operations in Syria. So my question to you, do you think like in the future, like is there a way Russia and US can work together, or is the confrontation between them inevitable?
Thank you. This is an extremely important point. In the Trump administration, we worked continuously with the Russians. Ultimately, Mike Pompeo, and I accompanied him, met with Putin in Sochi in the spring of 2019 to lay out a plan to implement the UN Security Council resolution and bring a permanent ceasefire and peace to Syria. In the end, Putin didn't accept that plan. By the way, that's the same plan that the Jordanian Foreign Minister Fadi and the UN are now pursuing at the moment with Assad and with the Russians. After the Biden administration took office, for some reason they stopped working with the Russians. The negotiations that were continuous in the Trump administration and in the Obama administration were for some reason stopped. This was well before the Ukrainian invasion, so that wasn't the reason, and I've never gotten a good explanation. I remain in contact with many of the Russians who I dealt with both during my time as a special envoy and even before. And they really think that there may be a way forward, because we and the Russians do have joint interests in Syria. First of all, we want the war to end. Secondly, we support, and the Russians have to support because they voted for it, the 2015 UN resolution that calls for a ceasefire and negotiations between the various sides. Finally, the Russians have important interests in Syria that are at risk. They're at risk by the presence of American, Turkish, and Israeli forces. And they're at risk, frankly, and the Russians admit this, by the presence of the Iranians, who are both supporting the Assad regime directly and through surrogates such as Hezbollah and Iraqi militias, but also undercutting the regime by bringing in their struggle with Israel and thus provoking Israeli retaliation, by burrowing into Syrian society and even Syrian religion in ways that make both the Russians and the Assad regime uncomfortable. So I believe that there is a way to get a resolution with Russia, because what Russia wants is a friendly government, not necessarily the Assad government, but a friendly government, and continued use of its bases. It's its biggest asset in the Middle East. It doesn't want to lose it, and that's the leverage point we should work on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jeffrey. And it's very clear, actually, that Syria obviously has been a battlefield for clashes between these regional powers. And I would like to elaborate on that kind of conflict between these regional powers. And with an eye on Russia and Iran, Dr. Quilliam, do you think that there has been a kind of power shift, if you want, with the involvement of Russia and Iran, especially after wars in Ukraine and Gaza? So we know, like the interference of Russia and Iran in Syria actually has well calculated for the Assad regime, and we know that up until 2015, actually, the opposition was in a way winning on the ground. Until the Russian interference in September 2015, actually, we know that also we have Iranians operating on the ground. We have Hezbollah. So do you think there has been a kind of change of dynamics, if you will, after October 7, after the war in Ukraine? What is your assessment of the situation? And do you think that the US can counter their influence, or are they deeply embedded in Syria?
Thank you very much for the question, and also thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I don't think there has been a significant rebalancing since October the 7th. There are always shifts, and there are always slight rebalancing processes taking place, but I don't think I've seen something, massive or major. But to sort of speak to Ambassador Jeffrey's point, I mean, I guess what we've seen an intensification, if you like, of the Iranian presence or Iranian proxy group presence in the country. We've seen the Iranians in particular, transporting material, transporting arms right across the Jordanian border, destined for the West Bank. So there's been a sort of heating up, I guess, of activity. We've seen the Russians set up sentry points in Quneitra. We've seen them sort of running patrols, but I think it's just more. It's almost more of the same. But I guess the activities have been more kinetic because of the Israeli strikes. We saw some over the weekend, some significant strikes, and what seemed to be a deployment of forces for a short period of time on the ground. So I think things are sort of heating up in Syria, but this is where it's really interesting. One of my colleagues, Hyatt, has sort of written about this and says that what's so interesting here is that whilst things are sort of heating up, whilst things are escalating because of what's taking place in Gaza, is that Assad is almost sort of disengaging, obviously as part of the axis of resistance, but not really sort of stepping forward into that space, and almost like creating this moment where we can sort of think about normalization, and normalization is complicated for all sorts of reasons, but it sort of fits into that kind of Saudi desire, Saudi and Emirati, but especially Saudi desire to de-escalate in areas of the region because it wants to focus on Vision 2030. So we're sort of seeing some shifts there, if you like. I don't think it's massive. I don't think there's anything major underway. The Iranians are, I think, to use the word you said, are deeply embedded and embedded in multiple ways. And the Russian presence, I don't think has shifted massively, but I think, as Ambassador Jeffries said, I mean, Russians had a long-term interest in securing its sort of military assets and military bases, and those are things that it's not ever going to want to give up. And those are the points of leverage, I think, moving forward.
The crisis of refugees. And we know that the refugee crisis in Syria actually has been the worst of our time. Actually, millions of Syrians have been displaced internally and abroad, and it had regional and global security consequences, actually, and it had determined some of European countries' refugee policies. So my question, Mr. Ghassan Hitto, you are deeply involved in humanitarian aid, and you work on the ground, I know, in Syria and in the northwest. So how do you think, what is your assessment of a humanitarian aid sent to Syria so far over the last decade? And particularly, what do you think the US could have done better?
Thank you very much, Dr. Fadi, and for inviting me to this program. Thank you for the Council of Arab American Relations and Ambassador Jeffries. It's a pleasure seeing you, and Dr. Quilliam for being with us today. I've listened with intent to what the both gentlemen have said. Let me add to that, because the humanitarian aspect is of extreme importance to paint the entire picture, and I would like to our viewers and listeners to think of what I'm about to say in terms of the importance of it for stabilizing the region, stabilizing the country. Like you said, half of the Syrian population have been displaced, and that is close to 13 million people. This is a large number. This makes it, aside from the situation in Gaza, the worst humanitarian crisis in recent history that in the world that we live in today. When we talk about the level of poverty, it's amazing that now in the literature of the UN and the USAID and other countries, you hear now, it's common to hear that's 90% of the Syrian people, and here I'm talking about all of Syria, not necessarily the north only. 90% of the Syrian people are living below the poverty line. 2.4 million school-aged children, they don't go to school. 1 million of those are in Northwest. In Northwest alone, from the city of Jarablus to Afrin to Idlib, that region that perhaps before the crisis have started in 2011, that region maybe had a population of 1.5 million people, and clearly it's relatively speaking underdeveloped compared to major cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and other cities. Today, the population of that region is 5.1 million people. 4.5 million of those have been basically labeled by the UN as people in need. In this region, where this 5.1 million people live, there are 2,000 camps. 2 million people live in these camps. 2 million people, about 800,000 of these 2 million live in makeshift camps. So when you look at the statistics, and let alone the refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and in Egypt and Europe and other countries, so the situation in Syria is really dire. And what's amazing to me, amazing in a sense, very surprising, when we look at the location of Syria, that is shared over 900 kilometers with a strategic US partner, a NATO ally, and also north of another strategic partner of the US. And then we see that this systematic destabilization of this country. When I say this systematic, let me back this with numbers. If you follow the humanitarian response plan, and look, don't take what I'm saying as being ungrateful. as a humanitarian, as a person who have led one of the largest humanitarian organizations inside Syria, I'm very grateful for every help. And as every U.S. official will tell you, the U.S. has been the largest contributor to humanitarian aid, and hands down, that is correct. There is nothing, it's not false. However, it's how much of a humanitarian aid came into Syria. So let me back this with some numbers, and that will paint the entire picture. If you look at the humanitarian response plan from 2014 to 2022, the pledges that the countries made, there's couple of years where those pledges were met at a 60%. Most of the years were 50% or above. So when we're talking about Syria, that has been classified as an emergency response mode, right? Meaning, basically what the UN have decided, this is the amount that we have decided is needed inside Syria, basically satisfies the most basic needs. 50% of the pledges have been met. In 2023, the year of the earthquake that hit southern Turkey and northwest Syria, the level of pledges that have been met dropped. I thought it would increase, dropped to 40%. This year, as of July 2024, the humanitarian pledges have reached only 21%. So when you look at that, add to that the U.S. have dropped its humanitarian commitment by 43%, immediately followed by the UK. Now, if you put these numbers alone, then you will conclude quickly that this country is being systematically destabilized. And when we look at this situation, when we look at education specifically, my dear friends, there are hundreds of thousands of children have been born into camps since 2011. These children are now teenagers. If I take you on a trip with me to go through the markets of Azaz to Afrin to Jarablus to Salqin, Harim, and 19 other villages and cities that I go through in the north, chances are when we meet these young teenagers, rarely we will find a child that knows how to read and write. So unless we pay close attention to the humanitarian needs in all of Syria, then talking about peace building, talking about stabilization, it becomes a very challenging and complicated topic. My fear is that 3 years from now, we're going to be sitting down talking about a problem that is very, very complicated just because we have ignored education so much for over 11 years. And that is going to be very expensive to solve. So without pointing at specific things, this gives you an idea about the attitude of the international community, U.S. is included, is on how Syria file has been handled.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hitto. And I think we all actually share your concerns about these challenges facing actually humanitarian aid, especially the funding challenges you mentioned, and even the security challenges, which we know are all the time there. But you mentioned that, of course, in reference to this, that Turkey has the 900-kilometer border with Syria, which is, of course, why very significantly Turkey was involved in the conflict in Syria. And I know, Ambassador Jeffrey, you were the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. You know very well about the Turkish government, actually how they work on things. My question is, we know that one of the concerns of Turkey in Syria has been the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the U.S. ally in Syria. We know, for example, the U.S. at the very beginning of the conflict, they were supporting moderate opposition groups, and then the U.S. strategy in Syria shifted to counterterrorism strategy. part of the reason why the United States is supporting the SDF is because the SDF is facing ISIS, and they are control, of course, of some of the camps which hold the jihadist fighters and their families. How, in your opinion, is the U.S. maneuvering, if you want, its alliance with Turkey as a NATO ally and its alliance with the SDF in Syria?
Thanks for raising that point. It is a very controversial one, and it occupied probably more of my time than any other issue, including even negotiating with the Russians or dealing with the Syrian opposition, which were very important. Turkey has a pressing issue in the PKK in general and its presence in the guise of the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeast Syria in particular. And it has a difficult diplomatic issue because its main ally in the world since the Korean War, the United States, is supporting the SDF. This means that Turkish rhetoric and at times Turkish actions appear to be very much opposed to the United States. And this is a major issue of discussion in every meeting of US and Turkish officials. But there's another reality. The existential threat from Turkey or Turkey is not from the PKK, however problematic that organization has been since it began its armed uprising in 1984. Rather, it is the march of Russia and Iran, traditional enemies of Turkey for a huge chunk of Eurasia, to its north and to its south particularly, but not just in Syria. So therefore, Turkey sees not just the SDF, not just the Islamic State, but Assad, the Russians, and the Iranians as potential threats. In that regard, the Turks are very happy, but they will not say it, that the United States is occupying two large portions of Syria, the northeast, minus some areas where the Russians moved in after 2019, and the Al-Tanf critical location in the south along the Jordanian border. The Turks' comments about the United States should just leave are only pro forma for domestic consumption. They want the United States to stay. They wished we had a partner other than the SDF, but they have heard us say 1,000 times, well, tell me who that would be. We don't know of any. And so the agreement we reached with the Turks in 2019, October, when Mike Pence went and met with President Erdogan in Ankara, which is essentially a ceasefire in the northeast, in the larger sense, has held. Now, there have been thousands of exchanges of fire between the SDF and the Turks in the northeast, but there's been no significant movement on the ground. And by the standards of Syrian ceasefires, it's another ceasefire. And both the United States and Turkey are committed to keeping it.
Thank you very much. And I think this kind of point related to whether the U.S. should stay or not is a discussion point I would like to raise actually in a follow-up question. But if we are still on the point of Turkey, Ambassador Jeffrey, recently there have been talks about possibilities for the Turkish government to open relations with the Syrian government. And we know recently there have been talks about a possible meeting between Erdogan and Assad. If this happens, and if the Turkish government re-engage with the Syrian government, how do you think the U.S. will navigate this complexity?
In the Trump administration, we would have actively opposed it. The Biden administration has been, frankly, maybe some of your listeners or some of the members of the panel will disagree, has been pretty supine on Syria, apart from doing the most important thing, which is by far the most important thing, keeping the troops on, keeping coordination with Israel and Turkey and the opposition in supporting UN Resolution 2254. While it hasn't done that with any particular gusto, it's done it enough to keep the policies that we instituted in 2018 to 2020 going. And that is very important. The U.S., whether it reacts badly as we did to the Emiratis in 2019, or basically not particularly enthusiastically, but not harshly, when the Jordanians in 2021 and 2022 pushed for Arab League recognition of a return of Assad, it isn't going to matter, because the underlying reasons for the splits between Jordan and the other Arab states and Assad, and between Turkey and Assad, remain. Until something changes, and that mainly means Assad changes his position on the treatment of his own population, on his welcoming of Iran, and allowing Iran to threaten in various ways Israel, Jordan, and potentially Turkey, there is not going to be any real rapprochement, and most importantly, Turkey is not going to withdraw its forces.
Thank you very much. And on that point of Iran, Ambassador Jeffrey, I would like to actually take this question to Dr. Quilliam. Part of the argument for why the U.S. troops are in northeast Syria actually is not only because they are supporting the SDF, but partly because they want to counterbalance the Iranian influence in the region, and of course focusing mainly on Syria. I would like to ask you, like, what is your assessment of the U.S. military existence in Syria? Is it useful, helpful, and what do you think the prospects are? Because there is an argument about, should the U.S. withdraw from Syria as they did in Afghanistan, for example, or should they stay? In your opinion, what is the significance of U.S. troops staying in Syria, and in an upcoming U.S. administration under Trump or Harris? Do you think the U.S. troops are staying or leaving?
Thank you for the question. It's a hard one to answer whether they're staying or they're leaving. My wish would be that they're remaining. Let's leave it at that. I imagine with a Harris presidency, I think we'll probably see more of the same. So I'm not sure that there would be, a shift to withdrawing. I think with President Trump, I'm a little uncertain as to where he would go with that policy. If it followed previous policy, I mean, we saw a wobble on there, but we saw this, we saw the troops remain in country. So yes, I mean, clearly they're serving, an important purpose. I mean, they are fighting, they're part of a counterterrorism operation. We know that ISIS is currently having a resurgence in the country, quite a significant uptick in activity, certainly in the last 6 months. So it's important that that the presence is there. It's important that the U.S. troops stay in country because of the Iranian interests, because of the Russian interests there. I mean, sort of withdrawing that card would create a vacuum that would be very quickly filled, most likely by the Iranians, although the Iranians are already very, very much present in the country. So the way I view it, it's a very important card. It gives the US leverage. It also, they've now been working very closely with the SDF, for a sustained period of time. That's an important ally. And I think in a region where states have been concerned about, US commitment, I think if there was to be a withdrawal, if the SDF were essentially cast aside, I think that would cause a mini earthquake, if you like, politically and diplomatically. I think the Saudis would be even more concerned than they've been concerned in the past. The Jordanians likewise. So it's much more than just having that 900 troop presence on the ground. There's a bigger picture than that.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure it's very hard to predict whether U.S. troops will stay or leave, and I appreciate your input here. And talking about the resurgence of ISIS, Mr. Ghassan Hitto, I know, to the best of my knowledge, that your foot on the ground, if you want, is in the northwest of Syria. But what is your assessment to the humanitarian aspects in the northeast? We know that there has been the issue of managing the concentration camps where the families of, the ISIS fighters are kept. There is this humanitarian issue, and we all know about the Al-Hawl camp, for example. How do you think the international community should address this, especially that we know that there has been an issue, of course, with European countries and other countries repatriating the jihadist fighters, and now especially, of course, with the resurgence of ISIS. How do you think the international community should address the humanitarian issue in the Northeast?
Let me just make a couple of points on the points that Ambassador Jeffries have made, because I think it feeds into this question. If we see President Erdogan and President of the United Bashar al-Assad, shaking hands tomorrow, what does that mean to Syria? Tomorrow, it means nothing, because the situation of the refugees will remain the same. Turkey will not resolve the issue of the refugees. The issue of safety will not be resolved inside Syria. The common wisdom, no one will disagree on this point, that Syria is not safe for the return of refugees, let alone the amount of destruction that took place inside Syria. There needs to be a lot of groundwork in order to receive back those refugees and repatriate a lot of Syrian citizens back into Syria. And the same to your later questions to Professor Neal is, will the U.S. leave or not? Look, I'm gonna spin it differently, right? Assume the U.S. left in the same style as it left Afghanistan. It further proves the point that I was making earlier during this program, and that is a systematic approach to destabilize the region. Then we will all be justified to scratch our head. Why? Why are we destabilizing this region in this vicious manner? So now, what should the international community do? Humanitarian assistance is directly related to stability. You cannot separate the two. Building relationship with Assad, working towards UN resolutions 2254 that Ambassador Jeffrey spoke about. This is all good and well, and we support. But the amount of assistance that is needed for Syria, it has to be looked at differently if the stability of the region is of key importance to the international community. So whether it is on the northeast, northwest, in Damascus, remember, there's a lot of suffering we all should agree that there is a great humanitarian concern in area under the regime control. This regime is unable to manage, and he doesn't have the will to do anything. He's just careless and letting two other countries roam and almost manage day-to-day operations inside Syria. So putting a lot of focus on him, I think, is of no significance. We should. I mean, we need the country to be stable. We need a solution, absolutely. But the question that you've asked regarding humanitarian access, I'm gonna just give it to you from basically the bottom line is, as is, the humanitarian assistance is not enough. The international community has said we need X, and they paid half of that X. So as is, they are very, very short of providing that assistance. If you compare a worse humanitarian crisis by the admission of many, and that is Syria, compare the assistance that the U.S. has put towards Ukraine, right, and compare that to Syria, it really it'll tell a story that we are far, far away from. If we need to fight ISIS properly, we've got to increase humanitarian access. We've got to spend on education. If we need to make sure that Syrians don't fall into the lap of Al-Qaeda and other extremist organizations, we've got to spend on education and humanitarian assistance. This is the work that needs to be done. Northeast, Northwest regime areas, we've got to focus on education, and otherwise these kids, young men, will fall into the lap of these extremists, and the problem will be a lot more complex, a lot more expensive to solve as time goes by.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hitto, for highlighting this very important point about education, actually. And I appreciate the fact that you mentioned the areas in Syria under the Assad regime control, because many people speak about the Northeast, the Northwest, but areas under the Assad control are no better than those two, actually. And this has been actually an aspect which the Assad regime has been using sometimes to blackmail the Arab Gulf states, actually, in return for having the refugees coming back, of course, to Syria. And on that point, I would like to a little bit expand, actually, on the Arab Gulf states and the Arab states in general. We know that the conflict in Syria starting in 2011 was part of the broader Arab Spring. And at the very beginning, there was support for the Syrian opposition from Arab states, especially Jordan and some Gulf states. But in the mid-2010s, actually, this kind of support waned, if you want, and with Assad actually gaining more regions in Syria with the support of Russia and Iran, there has been a shift in the way the Arab states approached the conflict in Syria. And recently, last year, 2023, Syria has been readmitted to the Arab League. So my question, Ambassador Jeffrey, as we know, the United States opposing the Assad regime, having sanctions on the Assad regime, how would this upcoming administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, navigate, if you want, the Arab Gulf states' involvement with the Assad? And on this topic, do you see any kind of future perspectives to the Arab states opening up relations with the Syrian regime?
That's a really good question, and I'll answer it indirectly first. How the U.S. would react to a new administration would react to the Arab League approach, and particularly if it began to have success, which would mean Assad accepting the roadmap that Foreign Minister Fadi in particular has laid out, would depend, first of all, on whether the United States had a comprehensive strategy towards Syria or not. It had one in the Obama administration. It had several, as you know, from time to time. We had one in the late Trump administration. And there doesn't seem to be one in the Biden administration. It's rather a whole series of things: support 2254, have the UN be in the lead, fight ISIS, keep our troops on, coordinate with Israel and Turkey. But there doesn't seem to be a larger geostrategic focus, even after October 7th, when the role of Iran in the region has become so obvious. So the first thing is, will a Harris or a Trump administration have an overall view of the region and Syria's place in it? That will then determine by deductive reasoning how you approach the Arabs and any success they have. If they had success with Assad that was based upon Assad actually making concessions on those things that the Arabs are concerned about, which is the Captagon crisis, which is threats to the Jordanian basic security that go beyond drugs, refugee return, and some kind of outreach to the opposition, then the United States would be basically compelled to go along. If, however, because it would basically fit either a overall U.S. strategy, which is to calm the region and push back Iranian influence, less so Russian influence, but certainly Iranian. But even if the U.S. still had a no grand strategy for Syria or for the region, but simply took things issue by issue, if the Arabs were to get something positive, the U.S. would go along and possibly would lift some sanctions, although that, as you know, is more a congressional than an administration issue. But that would require real movement by Assad. And that is the big question that many of you have been following for years. Is Assad willing to move? If Assad is not willing to move, further Arab concessions will be unlikely to be embraced by a new administration, whether it has an overall strategy towards Syria or it basically is looking at each of these elements as individual problems. If Assad isn't solving any of the problems he has created, an administration, even if it doesn't know what to do with Syria writ large, is not going to support giving Assad any benefits, and particularly will not support lifting sanctions when getting nothing. And certainly the U.S. Congress would not do so.
So obviously there are no concessions from Assad at this time, as we see, and there is no, as you mentioned, Ambassador Jeffrey, there is no like grand strategy for the U.S. to approach actually.
At the moment, I do not predict there will not be a grand strategy. As I said, the Obama administration had 2 or 3 or 4, but at any given time, it did have a strategy it was following. And the Trump administration, once Mike Pompeo got on board, did have a grand strategy as well, which you all know about.
So what we have so far actually is like very much sanctions, U.S. sanctions on the Syrian government, on the Syrian regime. And we know that this has been very much a challenging issue, especially sometimes for humanitarian aid and work. And before I elaborate on this humanitarian part with Mr. Ghassan Hitto, I would like just to ask you very quickly, Dr. Quilliam, this kind of sanctions-only policy, if you want, which the United States is taking towards the Assad regime, what is your assessment of this strategy? Is it successful? There have been actually arguments about some people who are saying these sanctions should be lifted, these sanctions should be combined with something else, these sanctions should be moderated in a way, modified. What do you think? What is your assessment of this sanction-only policy? Does it have to be changed? Is it imposing any challenges for people either in the, under the control of the Assad regime or even the northeast and northwest of Syria?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I should confess that when the European sanctions were first placed on Syria, I was serving in the UK government at that time, and I was a strong advocate for those sanctions. It was difficult to persuade part of the coalition of government to do that, but the group of which I was part of, we imposed those sanctions. So must accept responsibility, but was certainly party to that. But I think we've seen over a decade of sanctions now. We've seen no change in regime behavior. As Ambassador Jeffries was sort of alluding to, I mean, Assad has made no concessions whatsoever. And I think, on the broader scale, sanctions, and we've seen it in other theaters, tend to hit the public or tend to hit the population. I mean, targeted sanctions or smart sanctions, as we like to refer to them, can be effective, but they're on the whole evaded. And trying to stop that evasion is very difficult, very time-consuming, very complex. So it becomes more of I think, an ideological issue than one of great utility. So there's a sense that one's doing something by applying sanctions, and that gives a certain feeling, perhaps, of merit. But actually seeing the impact on the intended targets, it's very limited, and so the population ultimately get hurt, and that's the balance. And I would say, from my own position, my own sort of an analytical position, I sort of shifted it over the last couple of years away from this sort of, we must be seen to be doing something, or we must feel that we're doing something. If it's not working, then we definitely need to revisit and redress that.
Thank you very much. And let me take this to you, Mr. Ghassan, Hitto. Is there anything you want to follow up with Ambassador Jeffrey before I take it to Mr. Ghassan, Hitto? Because
I have a lot of sympathy for Neil's position. Sanctions do hurt people, but you have to look at sanctions as part of an overall approach that involves various forms of what we called in World War II attrition of the enemy, bombing, their sub-campaigns, our sub-campaigns, and all of that have an overall effect. Combined with the various military presences in Syria, the UN effort, sanctions and other things, we have gotten a frozen conflict. That is not a solution, but it is better than what we had before, up until 2018, 2019. Now, where I agree with Neil is, and where I disagree with the Biden administration is, I felt it was morally acceptable to do that sanctions and certain other things that we were supporting, only if you had a way forward to resolve this conflict. So it was a either or. The Biden administration, by giving up any real effort to pursue a larger solution other than pro forma support for the UN before effort, I think has raised questions about the moral virtue of those sanctions. But again, taken along with everything else that we and other countries have been doing, it has managed to freeze the conflict. That's not a heroic result, but look at Ukraine, look at Yemen, look at Gaza, and freezing a conflict begins to look better than the alternative.
And exactly, and under this moral question, we know sanctions have challenged, actually, humanitarian organizations working on the ground. And I want to take this to you, Mr. Ghassan, Hitto. Like, with those sanctions in place, we know that there have been many challenges with the humanitarian work and aid, especially in the Northwest, where your organization also operates. In your opinion, like these challenges, we know that the Northwest, for example, is run by a local governance, right? And the humanitarian support which you provide, which other organizations provide, are indispensable. How do these organizations like yours maneuver, if I say, work under these sanctions? And how do you think the U.S. should, or what do you think the U.S. should do better, actually, as far as its sanctions policy is concerned?
Let me say something that may appear to be an agreement and at the same time a disagreement with both Professor Neil and Ambassador Jeffries. Look, sanctions, in my opinion, don't hurt humanitarian access because there are enough exceptions built into these sanctions that allows humanitarian access to continue to flow into Syria. So, however, I like the term of smart sanctions. So I don't like to impose sanctions on institutions completely, but I think knowing this regime, smart sanctions should continue, and it should be more intensified as this regime figures out creative and dangerous way, as in Captagon trade, to finance its existence. So the other thing that I must emphasize, it's an issue of leadership. It's an issue of leadership. When we talk about the Saudi and the Emiratis and Turkey, for that matter, and other countries, let's not forget, and gentlemen, let me tell you, these countries will look to the US, will look to the UK for clear positions, and that will impact their decisions on how much they will spend and invest in the humanitarian access. So to me, yeah, sanction should remain. I am definite, and I don't believe that they hurt humanitarian access. I think it's the other narrative that pushes, oh, all these sanctions on the Assad regime, it's hurting people, it's not hurting Assad. I'm not convinced of that. There could be some of that, maybe because of how these sanctions are applied, but in principle, there is enough language and there is enough exceptions where actually both countries and even Europe and the UN were cognizant of the fact that these sanctions should not impact the humanitarian aid inflow into the country. It's the behavior of the regime. It's the regime that there is plenty of evidence that this regime actually took humanitarian access intended to reach the Syrian people, and guess what? And pushed it to the black market, and they were selling it for profit, right? So it's again an issue of leadership to ensure that the U.S. does not, and unfortunately, President Obama have set a bad precedence with his red line on the chemical attacks, right? And when he did not deliver on that red line, guess what happened? That opened the door for Russia and Iran and for those who supported the Syrian people, the actual victims, right? It actually pushed those to basically become relaxed, become a little bit indifferent, maybe, to the crisis, because the U.S. showed that it's not a priority anymore. Let Assad do whatever he wants to do against his own people. Let him continue the killing. Let him continue the bombardment. Let's not forget that at the time, up until 2016, 2017, barrel bombs were dropping from the skies. Those were not smart bombs, and they were causing tens of thousands of displacements every time each one of these bombs, dropped on the head of the people. That relaxed attitude, this indifference, this basically, I'm trying to find words that don't get me in trouble as a humanitarian. To me, it's an issue of leadership. We cannot let the country dive more into being destabilized. Right? Someone has to step up. Someone has to say enough is enough. This is hurting us as a US. This is hurting our allies. This is not sustainable. And the behavior of this regime that had his chance and share of power for 50 years, he and his father. And I think someone should put a stop to that. Looking for an alternative and keep saying that there is no alternative. I mean, look, so what are you saying? The Syrian people are stuck between ISIS and Assad? That's not fair. That is not even logical. Forget fairness aside, right? There are many options in this spectrum that someone who cares, and someone who is interested, and someone who has not fallen into complacency will find solution to this problem in the north and all of Syria. So I think sanctions are not necessarily hurtful in its absolute. And also, I will bring it back to an issue of leadership. The world is looking to the U.S. to basically say that Syria is important, and we will not accept that Syria will remain in the situation that it is right now.
And I would like to second actually your argument, Mr. Hitto, about like it's really very unfair to argue that there is no alternative and to keep the Syrian people actually stuck between, of course, like ISIS and the Assad regime. And I would like to come back here on this idea to the point you mentioned earlier, Ambassador Jeffrey, about the frozen conflict. And let me very quickly remind our audience that they can send us questions to our email, questions@ncusar.org. That is questions@ncusar.org. So you mentioned, Ambassador Jeffrey, that now the situation in Syria is a frozen conflict, which actually indeed it is. We know that European countries, for example, will not contribute to any reconstruction efforts in Syria unless there is a regime change, if you want, or a political settlement. We know that the Assad regime is not going in this direction so far. At the same time, there is a very huge risk of keeping the infrastructure in Syria decaying. So with no regime change in prospect, with no political solution, and with nobody willing to contribute or fund reconstruction as the status quo, how do you think the international community, the US, should navigate this complexity?
Again, I would strongly urge the new administration to build on the policies that have been carried on since 2018 over two administrations. Basically, that set of things, and we've talked about many of them, from troop presence to working with allies to 2254 to sanctions, to keep the conflict frozen while moving out in a far more high level and organized way to resolve the conflict. The answer to that is in Moscow. I would like to say Moscow and Tehran, but I don't think that any American administration is going to have much success with Tehran. The answer is Moscow, because Moscow is not happy with what is going on in the Middle East, and it sees, as you mentioned, we had for the first time Israeli ground forces running amok inside Syria just the other day. As I mentioned at the beginning, I used to say 5 outside military forces, and now the Jordanians from time to time are doing strikes against Assad, the Iranians, and others. And this is just going to get worse. It's just going to push the Russians into an ever riskier position. So there is a way to deal with this. The United States has tremendous control or leverage over Israel on what it does with Lebanon, which also, as you all know, is intimately not aligned, but intimately related to, even if totally independent from, Syria. And that gives us, through the Gaza conflict and this basically regional conflict we have now, where America is playing a very, very central role, more leverage to talk to the Russians. But we have to talk to the Russians. Now, Ukraine is an obstacle, and we're not here to talk about Ukraine, but believe me, a new administration should, and I think either Harris or certainly Trump would talk to the Russians about Ukraine. And in doing so, then that should open the door to having a high-level discussion about Syria and how to fix this thing. I think the Russians would be interested.
So if I step away from the United States for a moment and take the thing from the United Nations approach, if you want, and I would like to particularly ask you here, Dr. Quilliam, we know that UN-led peace talks on Syria have failed so far, and there is no prospect actually that these kind of talks will provide fruit in the near future. Some people blame actually the United Nations talks, and some people say that the international community itself is divided to how to approach Syria, while others point the finger to the Assad regime. In your assessment, what are things international diplomacy has failed to do? And I would like, if possible, you to point a finger to missed steps, if you want, or missed opportunities during the conflict, which the international community could have stepped in and changed something on the ground. So, what is your perspective on how to breathe, if you want, a new life into the peace process?
Thank you. That's a good question and a very big question. Breathing life into the process. I'll come to that in a minute. I mean, there was momentum, of course, in the early stages. We had the Geneva process, we had the Friends of Syria process, and we had the major Western powers, and we had the Arab states, coalescing together and working towards the Geneva process. But I mean, there were a series of events, I would say, that undermined the integrity of those, and of course, I mean, the red line. We keep going back to the red line, but the red line was a pivotal moment in terms of I guess the signal that was given to the regime and the signal that was perceived by Assad's partners, allies. Russia moving in September 2015. This was another major moment. These were kind of these are sort of mini earthquakes that shook and changed the environment through which a sort of political process could be pushed or couldn't be pushed. But I mean, the UN itself as a vehicle is we could speak about it for hours and hours, but ultimately it's flawed, and we know why it's flawed. We know there's gridlock at the Security Council, and this creates problems and creates issues. The Security Council did come together, did agree with came together with 2254. That is the resolution that remains in place. But as an organization, I mean, the UN just does not have the capacity. I mean, they've done some very interesting work, some very interesting sort of low-level work with civil society. They've tried to build from bottom up and made some progress. But when it comes to the realpolitik, the real decisions right at the top, it just does not have the authority or the weight to push through with that. And if you don't have all the big players on board really pushing ahead, and then if one wants to sort of ascribe responsibility or blame, I mean, everyone has to accept their part in that. But the regime, I mean, we're talking about it today when we're talking about normalization. I mean, Assad has made next to no concessions. I mean, he backs what he can take. He takes those relations on normalization. They won't necessarily advance for the reason Ambassador Jeffries said, particularly for Turkey and for Jordan. But he takes what he can. I mean, we've seen the Astana process, of course, and that's a subset, and that very much talks to Russia and Russia's role. And I think if we're thinking about how to move things forward, I would agree, entirely with Ambassador Jeffries that I think Moscow is the place, and that has to be a US, Russian conversation. I don't think Iran could be party to those conversations. Obviously, that's complicated in itself. But I think drawing out those differences, and at times we think they're vast, and at times we think they're less, but there are major differences in the way that Russia and Iran view and engage in Syria. I mean, Russia wants a sovereign state with institutions through which it can deal with, whereas the Iranians have sort of been burrowing under, and I would say undermining what remaining state structures, what military structures exist. and has compromised the integrity of that which operates in opposition to what the Russians want. So I think, the door to a solution to this is definitely in the Kremlin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Quilliam. And if I take my final question to you, Mr. Ghassan Hitto, before I take questions from the audience. You mentioned a few minutes ago, like it's very unfair for Syria to be stuck between, of course, ISIS and, the Assad regime. With an eye on the Syrian diaspora, actually all over the globe, we know in the United States, in Europe, the Syrian diaspora has intellectuals, professionals, and of course, people who are involved in all types of activities. So what role do you think the Syrian diaspora here in the US, all over the globe, can do for a future Syria? How can they get involved?
The Syrian diaspora is a great potential that has not and a treasure that has not been mined properly. Although many individuals in the Syrian diaspora have been very active, effective in all sorts of areas in advocating the Syria case or the Syrian cause. So I think paying more attention to them, whether they are in the United States, in Europe, Latin America, Arab countries, there is a lot of potential for that. For us in the Syrian Forum, we have started an initiative that pays a close attention to the diaspora. It's called Invest in Syria. In the context, in light of the situation of the humanitarian aids and assistance that is needed, we thought that we have to start an organic track, basically a Syria-driven track, and we called it Invest in Syria. The idea here is to encourage Syrians in the diaspora to invest in the country. That investment, this is not a non-for-profit stuff. We're basically telling them, you have a great opportunity if you accept the risk associated of doing business inside Syria. There is a financial benefit to you, but we're looking from our perspective as a Syrian Forum, we're looking at the social impact of such investment, and that is at the end of the day creating jobs. And when we create jobs, that means people are employed, they make income, and less and less dependence on aid. We will be able to encourage more students to go back to school. The chief reason for students not going to school, remember the number that I shared earlier, 2.4 million school-aged children don't go to school. The chief cause for not going to school is economy, is basically those children have to go and work. So when we have investments created inside Syria, all sorts of investments, small, medium, and large, we will be able to create jobs and help family engage from dependence on aid. So I think the diaspora they provide a lot of intellect. There is a lot of experience in the diaspora that we look at. Even at the Syrian Forum, we do a lot of we train a lot of individuals inside Syria remotely by using resources in the diaspora. Will the diaspora play a significant role in designing and helping pushing a political solution? Absolutely. They should not be hesitant. They should not be bashful. I encourage all Syrian and whether they are in the US and Europe to actively participate in pushing towards stabilizing Syria and as such coming up with the solutions or helping countries that they have become citizens of to shape their policies to push towards Syria. I think when I talk about leadership, I think people in the diaspora will play a role in causing the U.S. and Europe and the UK to basically wake up, from this sleep over that President Obama caused with that his earthquake of that he created by the red line. They need to be active, and they need to advocate the Syrian cause. They need to be in the hallways of Congress and the Senate. They need to be talking to the State Department, to the White House, and be vigilant and be persistent and be tenacious in making sure that their voices are heard. So their role is of great significance, and they should not underestimate what they can do. Talking about earthquake, by the way, and I love this analogy, Professor Neil. Now you've taught me something new. Is another little earthquake that's going to happen, and I hope it's not going to be the nail in the coffin of the Syrian cause. Now we're talking about the lapse of the Caesar Act. You know what's going to happen when the Caesar Act lapses? You're going to see demonstrations in the street of Damascus of those Assad supporters, again, celebrating another victory and the potency of this stubbornness, of this indifference of this Assad regime. Basically, it's a stamp of approval. Basically, the international community and the U.S. telling him, look, do what you want, it's if no consequence to us. And by the way, that Caesar Act that caused you so many things, now we're going to remove it. Now you've got more tools available to you to do further damage. So we've got another earthquake awaits us, and I have encouraged my fellow Syrian Americans to basically pay close attention to that, to make sure that the Caesar Act is extended, and otherwise it is going to be it's going to take the file into a new dimensions that it's going to be beyond the context of what we have talking about. It will embolden Iran, it will embolden Syria, it will maybe Russia will be further entrenched in its positions. So we just have to be careful with these things. Once again, it's a position of leadership. If the U.S. plays the role of being the leader and not just everybody towards a common goal, I think we will see a significant difference in the Syrian file.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hitto, and I hope your message will go viral actually through this panel, of course. And since we have a couple of minutes, let me take a few questions from our audience. One of these questions I got here actually possibly is leaning on the question we raised earlier about power shift. So the question here: what are the implications of recent geopolitical shifts in the region after a possible ceasefire in Gaza? And the balance of power among its allies and adversaries. So if I take this question to you, Ambassador Jeffrey, so if the ceasefire in Gaza happens, do you see power shift happening in the region towards like the adversaries or the allies of the Syrian regime? What are the prospects?
The shift in power in the region since October 7th has been profound, but not well understood because of the focus on highly important transitory things such as civilian casualties, humanitarian delivery, hostages, fear of escalation. The point is, the United States, Israel, and at times a broad alliance of other states, European and Arab, have pushed back dramatically across the region against Iran and its proxies. One way or another, Hamas is going to be taken out of the equation for a long time. Hezbollah probably will be forced to at least retreat tactically. And Iran has been shown as incapable or unwilling to seriously challenge either the United States or Israel as all of this is happening. Now, if we were an imperial power like the Romans or the British in the 19th century, I would, assume that whoever assumes control in Washington in January will continue this because it's obviously in the advantage of the United States and of the people of the region and of our partners and allies. But we're America. And as we all know, we do crazy things. I still think that the likelihood is that we will build upon this, because any other alternative would descend into chaos. Essentially, Iran's march through the region has been stopped. And once you get a ceasefire in Gaza and resolve Hezbollah to one or another degree, you will have frozen the overall regional conflict in the same way we have frozen the Syrian conflict. That's not a solution, but it opens the door to working for one. So I'm basically optimistic, assuming that the new administration will do the obvious and advantageous. But my confidence that administrations do the obvious and advantageous is a bit more limited than perhaps other people's.
We all hope actually that there will be a lot of optimism coming ahead, hopefully. So I would love to share this with you, Ambassador Jeffrey. I would like to conclude with one question I have here, which is, Mr. Hitto, touching on your point, which you raised earlier about education. So the question which I received here is, how has Syria's educational system been affected by the conflict? And what are the prospects of rebuilding the sector to meet the needs of the next generation? If you can say something very quick about this, please.
I'm going to type very quick. Look, again, education, education, education. If we need a stable Syria, is education. If we need to fight extremism, it's education. If we need to fight ISIS, it's education. We've got to strengthen this path. What happens, keeping Syria in an emergency response mode, that means technically the funding in the humanitarian bucket, if you will, naturally it's limited. Today, if you push for funding for middle and high school inside Syria, the answer is it is unnecessary. Not because they're bad people, just because the way the funding, the humanitarian bucket has been designed does not address that issue. But because the crisis has been long right now, at over 11 years, then we have now to pay very, very close attention to it. The earthquake alone has put over 640 schools in northwest Syria out of service. And who's paying the bill is basically the humanitarian aid and also individual donations coming from the diaspora. So what needs to happen? Look, I'm passionate about education. I'm not the expert, but if you bring experts on education in Syria, they will tell you that the infrastructure of the education sector inside Syria was poor and lacking even before the crisis. So the whole sector needs overhaul. We need to build more facilities to bring students into classrooms. We need to address the issue of the education gap. We need to figure out how we can implement more vocational schools. Not all students, need to or have the abilities to complete high school and go to universities. We have to pay close attention to creating funds for middle and high school and higher educations, universities like the University of Aleppo and other universities inside Syria. All of these things poses a lot of challenges. The reason I'm mentioning all of that, trust me, when you look at the funds available for education, and my hat's off for the UK. UK has a leading role in education. There's Europe has done some also work in education. But what I'm saying is the problem is so huge, is so big, is so large. What's being invested and spent is not even near enough. There are 2.4 million school-aged children we need to be brought into classrooms, and that has to there has to be a serious plan, a serious funding to achieve that. Once again, Europe's interest is at the heart of education. U.S. interest is in the heart of education. The region interest is in the heart of education, because if we don't do that, the alternative is extremism. The alternative is ISIS. The alternative is crazy people roaming the streets. And this is what we don't want. We want to raise a generation that aspires to a good life, We want those kids to basically get out of their mind that they are destined to live in makeshift camps, and there is another life, a better life waiting for them. And the only way we can do that is we take that child out of a tent and put him inside the classrooms so we can give him a glimpse of what a normal life is. His norm is not living in a camp the rest of his life, and the cost of fixing this problem is going to be far more expensive, and the solutions will be far more complicated.
I can't agree. I can't agree more, Mr. Hitto. And if I can take one final question only, and I know we touched in some detail about this, but if I can conclude with this question to you, Dr. Quilliam. So the question here coming is, how has Syria's economy been reshaped by the war, sanctions, and regional trade dynamics? I think we addressed this already, but if you can say, and what are the potential avenues for economic recovery? If you can address this part of the question, please. So what do you think are the potential avenues for economic recovery in Syria? If you can, just in 1 minute, please, take this.
Sure, I can probably do it in half a minute. I mean, I don't think early recovery or recovery is going to take place until there's a political solution. I think the issue is, it really requires the US or the EU to come up with the funding, and that, until those conditions are met, the money's not going to come, essentially. If normalization with Syria goes ahead and Assad makes those concessions, then we may see some funding coming in from the Gulf. We have seen the Emiratis putting some money in, but everything is contingent on those concessions or coming towards a resolution. The Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese are not going to be putting money into reconstruction or reviving the economy.
So let's see how this plays out, and hopefully there will be some concessions, there will be some funding, and on this hopeful, if you want to kind of note on funding, on education, as Mr. Hitto referred to, and the optimism which Ambassador Jeffrey referred to, I would like to conclude this panel with a positive energy vibe, if you want. So we all agree that Syria is actually not an isolated conflict. The impacts are regional and global, and there should be interference actually from the United States, from the international community. There should be military cooperation, humanitarian aid, economic support, all parties working together actually to defroze that frozen conflict, if you want, and bring a solution to the crisis in Syria. With this, I would like to thank you very much, our generous and distinguished guests, for your thought-provoking, I will say, points, discussions, and answer to the questions. And I would like, actually, hopefully, to carry on this discussion, actually, in the future. And thank you very much. I will turn it back to Dale.
Fadi, thank you very much, Dr. Fadi. To all of you out there, I know we're coming right up on our finish line here. So I would very much like to thank Ambassador Jeffrey, Dr. Quilliam, Mr. Hitto for your valuable insights. I think this conversation is a vital step in continuing the dialogue of how best to navigate the U.S. policy with Syria. I'm hoping that people will be listening and will be reviewing this. I think that the most valuable part of us getting together like this is to take your passion, your intellect, your incredibly valuable insights from your actual experiences, and to be able to share them with our viewers, who are, some of them might be very up on the situation happening in the region and in Syria specifically, but I would venture to guess that a lot of viewers would not have the information that you've related today, and I'm hoping this will stimulate some terrific thought. I can't wait to share this with our thousands of Model Arab League students that participate with the National Council every year. This would be wonderful, thought-provoking, and we look forward to circling back to you all for an update, hopefully with some more positive news in the futures. So with that, I thank you all very much. Roland Robinson, thank you. Roland is is my most valued staff member who put this all on and will make sure that this is on YouTube for further review. Thank you, Roland, for all the time that you spent to set this up. Dr. Fadi, you killed it. This was terrific. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful remainder of the week, a good weekend. Be safe, and God bless.
Thank you.
We're out.